Hello, and welcome to another Niagara tutorial. In my last couple of videos, we covered the basics of Niagara, so if you don't know how to use Niagara, I highly recommend you go look at those videos. They're a little bit long, but you can put them on 2x speed, and they're well worth watching. You know, you can start off there, and you will learn the basics of Niagara pretty quickly and feel pretty confident to move on to making a particle system in Niagara. In this video, we are not going to be covering all those basics. We will be introducing some new things that we didn't do in those tutorial videos, but we're mainly going to be focused on a particle system, creating a specific effect. And the effect that we're working on in this video is a fire effect. We're looking to make a campfire style effect. It's not going to be super realistic. We're trying to make a stylized kind of fire effect here, something that you might see in more of an indie kind of game like Firewatch or something like that. So, you know, if you wanted to do a realistic fire effect, this is not the tutorial for that. There are doubtlessly some tutorials out there that exist for that. In this one, we're just going to go for a simple fire effect. We're going to combine a couple different emitters to do this effect. The main emitter is going to be a mesh emitter, which we have not used yet in this series. And then we're also going to apply an effect that I just learned about yesterday, which is super cool. It's a distortion effect, and it's going to give a nice little heat distortion around the campfire. So we're going to start off as we always do. I have a project here, and we need to enable Niagara because it is in beta and it is not automatically enabled. So go to plugins, FX, click enabled. Click yes, and then restart. It'll restart, and then we'll come right back in. And we're back. So now we are going to create a folder called Particle Systems, since this is a fresh project. So Particle Systems, we're going to create a folder called Campfire. So in this folder, we are going to create our first emitter. We are going to use a upward mesh burst, and we're going to call this PEN campfire flames. So this is going to be the core effect, core emitter for this effect. So we're going to open this. Open in a different window for some reason. We're going to drag it into the main window. So you can see what this basic emitter is doing is it's just spawning this this arrow mesh in sort of an upward cone, and it's flying up and then disappearing. We don't necessarily want that cone, so we're actually going to delete that, and we're going to replace it with an add velocity. So just add velocity. We're going to change those numbers later. I just want to put that in there for now. And we are going to change the mesh to just a sphere because we want a sphere for this. So you might actually have to go to view options, since this is a new project. I haven't enabled this yet. I can't see the spheres from the engine content, so what you need to do is go in this little eye here and go to show engine content and click that. So we go sphere. Whoa, we go sphere. And there are a bunch of spheres. I want one in particular because of the size of it. Eventually, though, for an effect like this, you might want to make a sphere that's a little bit has less verts. This one has quite a few, so if you look at it, it's like 560. You can make something smaller for an effect like this. We're just going with this for the simplicity of it. So we've got our sphere. Now what we want to do is we want to make a material to go on the sphere. So I made my material in Photoshop, and I'll just quickly go over how I did that. I just drew it, and it looks not super great, but you'll see once it's mapped onto a sphere that it looks a lot better. Artists are probably cringing at this, but really it doesn't need to be super great. Obviously, the more work you put in, the finer the details will be, but this works pretty well for what we want. You notice it's pretty simple. I have this other version of it that I had made that was a lot more complex. And the thing I noticed is that the simpler you go with these little flame tongues, the better. You don't want it to be overly complex. Otherwise, the effect starts to look messy. Other things here. So we want it on a black background because we're going to do an additive effect. We're not going for translucent, so we don't really care about opacity. We just want the background to be black. We want a little bit of variation so that you kind of have variations in brightness. And that's pretty much the important stuff. I exported it as, and it might not actually show this. Oh, it does. Okay. I exported it as a PNG, 128 by 128, pretty small. I mean, you don't really need a super high resolution texture for this. You will not notice the fact that it's kind of pixelated or kind of rough around the edges. So got that there. Actually, I should probably just export that again because I don't think I have that exported saved. Yeah. So we're just going to call that Fireball PNG, save it. And then I'm going to drag and drop that into the project. So now I have Fireball PNG. We're going to open that up. We're going to change texture group to effects, and we're going to compress without alpha. I exported it without alpha, so shouldn't be there, but just in case, it'll get rid of it. Save that. So we're going to go back, and we're going to right click on it and go to create material, and we're going to call this flames. So we're going to go in here, and a couple things we're going to do. We're going to alt click to disconnect this. We're going to click on the material inputs, and we're going to go unlit and additive. So additive for the blend mode, unlit for the shading model. Unlit because this is A, because it's cheaper performance wise, and B, because this is a fire and it's actually going to be emissive, so you don't need it to receive lighting. It's actually going to give off light. Additive, because the way that additive works and why it's different than translucent is that instead of just relying on opacity, which it can also use opacity, but what it does is for every pixel that is not completely transparent, if you're using opacity, for every pixel, it's going to add that value to what's behind it. So for blacks, it's adding 0. So no effect. So that's essentially like translucency or transparency. And then for whites, it's adding 1 to all the RGB values. So that's pretty useful for us. So essentially what that's going to do is if we spawn a bunch of particles on top of each other, they're going to add up and create a much brighter, more emissive material that gives you a little bit of bloom. So, so we're going to wind up plugging this into emissive. But what we want to do first is to get a particle color, because we don't want this to just be white. We actually want the particle to be driving the color of the flames. So we're going to multiply. Whoop, that was the wrong thing. Just M click, much easier. Okay. We're going to multiply, and any of the channels is fine since it's just grayscale. And then we're going to plug that into emissive color. And so you'll notice it's on here. It looks transparent, but what it's really doing is just adding that value to the stuff behind it. And you can see now that we've wrapped it onto an orb, it kind of looks like flames looking up. And once we get a lot of these particles together and they're random rotations and moving, it'll look like flames, you know, sort of licking around and things like that. So that should be good for now. That's all we need. It's super, super simple texture. So main things you want to remember are additive and unlit. You could do two-sided. We're not going to do it here. It doesn't really matter all that much for us. So we're going to save that. Then we're going to go back to our particle emitter, and we're going to go looking for flames in the material. We're going to add that. So you can see for whatever reason it did not compile. So give it a second. There we go. So you can see now got this weird little shape here with the material on it. It's not quite a sphere because of the stuff in the template emitter has a specific scale. And we'll fix that in a minute. First thing we want to do, though, is we want to change things like spawn rate. So we actually want to have things spawning fairly constantly, but not necessarily consistently. So what we're going to do is we're going to change the spawn rate to a ranged float. And we're going to make that 30 to 50. And then we also do want to do some bursts. And we're going to do all this range too because it's fire, and we want it to be a little random, feel a little bit more dynamic. Most of the things that we do in here are going to have a range just to drive that dynamism. So we're going to do a ranged int, and we'll say between 5 and 10, 5 for minimum, 10 for max, and same with the spawn time. We're going to do a range, and what this is essentially going to do is it's going to say spawn the burst at a random time during the life cycle. And so we also need to go into the life cycle here, put that to 3, and we're going to put the max loop count to 0 because we don't actually want to cap the number of loops. So now you can see we're spawning a lot of particles on top of each other. It's going really weird, kind of cool effect. Not exactly what we want, so we're going to keep scrolling down here and see what we can do to make this look a little bit more like fire. So the first thing we're going to do is go into velocity here. And we're going to once again make this a range. So ranged vector, and we want it to be 0 on the X and Y. And really, like you could impart a little velocity there, but I find that that's weird. That rotation looks a little strange. I don't know why I did that. You could impart a little velocity on the X and the Y. However, I don't really like the way that manifests itself in the fire. I actually like to change where the particles are spawning to get a little bit of fluidity into the motion of the flames. So I'll show you that in a minute. But right now we're just going to give a range to the Z value, which is 50 to 100. So you can see automatically they're moving a little bit. However, it doesn't look like they're moving that much because of the scale that is automatically added in here in this template. So what we're going to do is we're going to have that arrange as well. Get more ranges. So the minimum 0.2, 0.2, 0.2, 0.3, 0.3, 0.3 for the max. And now you can see we're starting to get something that maybe could look like fire. It's obviously not there yet because we don't have rotation. So what we want to do is add a random initial rotation to all of these to make it a little bit more interesting looking. So we're going to type in initial rotation, initial mesh rotation. Once again, we are going to make every last one of these ranged. So just grind through this, uniform range float, and uniform ranged float. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to say negative 360 to 360 for all of them so that it can basically just have the full range of orientations. And already this is starting to look a lot more like fire. You can see looks way nicer than it did a second ago. And every little change like this we make that adds a little bit of randomness into this system is going to make this effect look better. So the next thing that we want to do to make it look even more like fire is to give it a box location. We don't want that much. You can see that almost kind of looks like fire coming off the surface, but we want it to really be more like almost coming out of a small area, just because this would be like a campfire on top of some logs. So you're not really going to have a huge area in there. We also, oh, I put that in the wrong box. Sorry about that. Here, you want to change the box size. We're going to go with 5, 5, and 5. That kind of gives us a small range. You can see there's a little bit of something there. It's not quite where we want it just yet, but you can see there's a little bit more variability to the column of the fire so that it actually looks like there's some motion in there, some fluidity. But we still have some stuff to do here to make this look a little bit better. So we're going to go into color in the particle update now. So this is no longer just the spawning parameters, but what's happening over the life. So we're going to change this from make linear color from vector and float to, to color from curve. So this node basically lets you plot out color over life, and then alpha over life on the bottom. So we're going to start off by right clicking and adding, wow, that really doesn't want to work right. Okay, adding a key to all curves. So it's going to start off, it's going to be fully, well, maybe not, actually, we're probably going to change this a little bit. it'll be 0.75. It won't be fully opaque at the start. It'll kind of come into existence a little bit, so it doesn't pop in. So it'll eventually we'll add something over here that'll be 1, so it'll just kind of fade into existence and fade back out to 0 over time. So actually we can just do that now. We'll add a key here. We'll put it at 1. Whoa, I put Q in. It's not a opacity that you can use. Q is not right. So we'll have 1 at 0.5 and 0 at 1. So basically you can see it doesn't appear to be doing that. I think I probably need to change lifetime here. Actually, that doesn't make sense. Why is that doing that? You can see they're popping out for some reason, and they probably should not be. Opacity. Okay, what I did here is I didn't use opacity, and that's one of the gotchas of not using opacity, is that you might try and use it down here when you're not supposed to. So we're just going to remove all of those because they're not actually doing anything. They're not plugged into anything. So what we actually need to do here is make this black at the end. So now you can see, because we haven't added material, they're actually fading out because they're adding 0 to what's behind it. So again, that's something you got to keep in mind, is additive does not use the alpha channel. And in fact, you can still send alpha information from a particle system to an additive material. You can still use it. It's actually kind of useful because you can use that as a parameter that you're already sending back. So you can change it down here over life, and then you can send it back, and you could use this as a scalar parameter for things. So that's something pretty useful that you can do since you're not using it. And that was a great way for me to turn my brain fart into a teachable moment. So now getting back to this, what we want is we want to start off at a pretty bright color. And what we're going to do here is we're going to have it sort of look whitish, but off-white, so a little bit yellow. So we're going to go 1.95 and 0. Well, that's a little bit too yellow. Sorry, I meant to not do 0. 0.54 is what I should go for. So now you can see a little yellowish off-white is where it's going to start off at. And then we're going to put this at 0.3 seconds. Actually, 0.1 seconds. 0.1 seconds. And we're going to change that color. And this one is going to be a lot more yellow. So we're going to have initially like a very bright core to the fire. And then we're going to change that color over the life of the particle so that it gets more yellowish and then more orangish as it fades out. So what do we want? We want 1.67 and 0. So I felt out all these colors ahead of time. It's a good idea to kind of go through and just fiddle with numbers. When you're doing something like this, you're not gonna have the colors right off the bat. You're gonna want to figure it out. You're gonna want to base it on what your game's gonna look like. But here I have all these sort of figured out. So we're going to go 0.4 here, and then we're going to go to choose color. We're going to go 1.025 and 0. Okay. So now you can see it starts off pretty bright, gets yellowish, and then gets orangish over life. If we turn off this background, we can see that a little bit better. So you can see there's this little bright core in there. It gets yellowish and then gets orangish and then fades out into nothing. So if we can actually drag this out a little bit more so you can see a little bit more of that color over life. There we go. That looks pretty good. So just kind of tweak the numbers until you get something that you like. But yeah, so now we've got color over life. The next thing we want to do is we want to scale the size over life. So this already has a size over life in here. So we're going to look at this. We're actually going to change all these values. We don't like any of them. So this is just a scaler that's going to scale all the axes at the same rate. So it's basically going to take all three vector directions that we already have, which are random, independent of each other. So those can be kind of stretched, but it's going to keep those at the same ratio over life. So we're going to put this at 0, and we're going to say 0.5 for the first one. We're going to go say 0.3 and 1 for the second one. And then at the very end, time 1, we're going to go 0. So now we've got sort of a nice little teardrop shape where the flames are kind of small to begin with, get bigger around the center or around the middle of the particle's life, and then fade off to something small as they kind of become translucent or add no color information to the scene. Actually, I might just, now that I have the shape worked out right, I might just put these back. I think that I had worked out these colors after I had done the shape. Yeah, now you can see the white is pretty prominent, or the lighter color is pretty prominent, and it fades off nicely into this nice little color gradient here. So now that we've done the mesh size, we want to do a rotation rate so that these particles aren't just always at the same rotation over their life. So on particle update, we're going to click and we're going to go to rotation. So we're going to go to mesh rotation rate. And we're going to do this ranged. However, just know that when you do this way, it is actually changing the rotation rate every frame. So instead of having a constant rate here that you define, when you set it an update like this, it's picking a different rate every frame for that individual particle. So if you really wanted to do a random but constant rate, you would go up here into spawn, and then you would add a new variable. So you could create a new variable. You could do a vector, you could do a float, however you want to do it, where you defined an initial rate that is ranged, and then you come down here into mesh rotation rate and you feed those in individually so that it's constant for each particle every frame. The way that we're doing it now, we're doing a fire, so it's not really that big of a deal. You're not really going to see whether or not each particle is rotating at the same rate over life. And kind of erratic behavior works for fire. Ooh, that was wrong. That was the wrong thing. Don't want to put 180 into the rotation rate because that's a little crazy, but that's a little bit too much. But yeah, you don't really see the rate of the individual particles. Instead, you just get sort of erratic behavior that works for fire. So now you can see they're rotating. You can tell they're rotating. You can't really tell if it's static or not, or if it's a static rate or not. But it works for our effect. Another thing to note, because I tried this, if you put negative 180 into here, and 180 on the maximum, so negative 180 on the minimum and 180 on the maximum, since it's random, it's sort of going to cancel out. So you're going to get your particles jittering back and forth a little bit. You don't really want that. It would be sort of nice for this effect to have things rotating in either direction, but you can't really tell looking at this that they're only rotating in one direction. So it's fine for our purposes. But again, just keep in mind there are a bunch of gotchas associated with this. If you're trying to do a random rotation rate for each particle, you have to keep a lot of things in mind, because this is doing it every frame, and the fact that it's going to pick a random number can really bite you, especially if you do a negative to a positive, because then you could be canceling out what you're attempting to do. So keep all that in mind. But now you can see we have a pretty good core for our fire effect here. We have these flames that look pretty nice. So what we're going to do is we're now going to create a particle system out of this. And we're going to name it PSN campfire. We're going to drag it out here. Of course, it's not updating, so we gotta open it, see it's here. And now we can go into the world, take a look at it. Whoop. Okay, so you can see pretty nice little stylized fire effect. You know, this, if you're looking at it from far away, this is probably going to do the job on its own. You don't really need to add too much to this. You could have this as a torch, a campfire, some sort of spell with a little fireball. You could do a bunch of different things with that. But if you get close to this, there are a few things we could add to this that would make this a little bit nicer. So we're going to move on to the next part where we add another emitter to this particle system that's going to give it a little bit more life. So what we're going to do here is add a new emitter. We're going to do a fountain for this one, and we're going to call this PEN campfire embers. We're going to open that up. So we're going to collapse the headers so we can see what we got here. We don't want to calculate the size by mass, so we're going to get rid of that. We don't want gravity or drag force on these. Essentially what we're going to do is we're going to be spawning little particles that are like embers, and they're floating upwards on the, I forget what the updraft, I think is the term, from the heat of the fire. So they're going to be floating upwards, so we don't really want to give them gravity. They're not going to live long enough to fall to the ground. They're just going to kind of fly upward and then disappear. So now that we've deleted those things, we want to change the spawn rate because obviously we're getting way too many particles here. So we want this to, once again, be a range. And then we're going to change the range to 0 to 5. So now this already kind of almost looks like embers because you're getting just a random effusive spray upwards of tiny particles. There's still a lot we got to do to this, but it's already looking much better than it was a second ago. So now we're going to go to set variables here. We're going to give the lifetime a bit of a range here. So we want to go from 0.5 to 2. So some of these are going to fade out a lot quicker than others. Some of them are going to live a little bit longer. We actually want to change the mass here because this affects the forces and velocity calculations, and we're going to do some interesting forces to make these twirl a little bit. So we want to make them have a pretty low mass. So we're going to go minimum of 0.02 and maximum of 0.05. And you can already see, as a result of making these a lot lighter, they're just shooting off. So we're definitely going to have to change the velocities quite a bit to make this not look ridiculous. So we are going to go, let's say, negative 0.5 is probably good. Negative 0.5, 2, then we're going to go 0.5, 0.5, and 5. So you can see now they're just kind of spawning and coming up at a reasonable clip. You don't want to go too fast. We're going to go back up here now that things are moving at a reasonable clip. Remove the sprite rotation, and we're going to add size, sprite size. So or set sprite size here. We don't, well. So this is one thing to note. If you go up here where you have set variables already happening in spawn, and you click to set a variable, it will give you another window. We're not going to do that here. We're going to go and click on this little arrow and go to add variable, and then you can do it in the same little box. It doesn't make a huge difference, but it keeps looking a little nicer. So we're going to do sprite size. We're going to do, like we did in the last couple of videos, vector 2D from float. So this float is going to drive the same values, or both the X and the Y values, since this is a sprite and we don't want it to stretch. So then we're also going to do uniform range so that we get a range between 0.5 and 1.5. So now you can't even see them anymore. And so we got to zoom in pretty far. Oh boy, they're pretty small. Let's add them to our campfire, and you'll be able to see them a lot better here. since they're already, I've already done all the numbers to scale them appropriately. So now you can see we've got these little particles coming up, already looking pretty decent actually, but we're gonna add a little bit to this to make it look more interesting. So we've got all of our initial variables here worked out. We've got our velocity. We want to change the spawn location ever so slightly just to fit our fire better. So we're going to give the sphere location a radius of 10. Now we are going to step down into the update. And here's where we're going to add some nice forces to give some interesting motion to these particles. So the first one we're going to do is we're going to add a curl noise force, sorry. And the way I understand how this works is that it's basically a field of vectors, and so they're generating a random field of vectors based off of noise. And so the way that it's going to work is when a particle goes through that field of vectors, each frame, whatever vector is closest to it or whatever part of the field it's in, it's going to use that vector to act as a force on the particle. So these are all pointing in different directions since it's a noise. So as the particle goes through, it's going to be affected randomly, which kind of works for undulations in a fire and also wind that can sort of blow these particles around. So we're going to leave the initial values the same here because they work for us. And then we're going to add another force here, which is going to be a vortex. Whoop, it went away. Why did that go away? Vortex force. So we're going to open that up. Once again, we got to drag it above solve forces and velocity so that it'll be taken into account. We want to move this down to 50 for the vortex force amount so it's not overpowering. We also want to give some origin pull so that these particles are swirling around the vortex's axis. So now let's just save that and take a look at what this looks like. So now you can see the particles kind of have a little bit of a random twirl to them. They don't just go straight up along whatever their predetermined velocity was. They kind of curl around. Some of them go straight up, some of them curl around. They do a lot of interesting things. It gives it a little bit nicer, more realistic looking behavior. So now that we've got a movement we like, and you can kind of tweak those numbers if you want to have it move slightly different, but I think that looks pretty good. We're going to move now to color, and you can see what this is doing is it's essentially giving us just white to black, opaque to transparent over time. We want to change this a little bit because we want it to have a little bit of color to it. So this is going to start off, this will be a 1, that's fine. This is not the same material that we used before. This is not additive, or it might be, but it's got translucency to it. So we're actually going to take advantage of that here. And what we're going to do is we're going to make a super bright emissive color so that these really pop out. So we're going to go 10, 2.5, and 0. I think, yeah. 10, 2.5, and 0, which will give us really bright color. And then over time, we're going to decrease that color. So we're just going to go 1.25 and 0. So it's the same color. It's this orangish color. This color curve doesn't, once you increase the numbers over 1, it kind of glitches out. It doesn't show you exactly what the color is going to look like because it's emissive. So this is what the color is going to look like, and it'll be less bloomy, emissive, bright. So that's how this is going to work. Over time, it's going to get dimmer, and it's also going to become more transparent. And that should do it for this. So pretty simple emitter, but it's going to add interesting effect in here. And I'm wondering, I'm not seeing the color I just did. So I saved this. Just want to make sure. Yep, save that. So let's look at embers here and let's look at the color. It is doing it, supposedly. Not looking like what I think it should look like though. Let me just delete this and re-add it just in case it's kind of glitching out there. Yeah, there you go. So for whatever reason, it was not updating, even though it said it was. It had the correct color over here. but that was not showing in the viewport. So now you can see they're orangish. They're just kind of coming up and then randomly swirling around and then fading out. And they've got a range to their life, so they're, you know, they're starting off, and then some of them are going in half a second, some of them are taking 2 full seconds. Kind of gives you that ember feeling that you see in a real campfire. You get a bunch shooting out. It's not really a consistent spawn rate. They just sort of happen. And then some of them just kind of fall because they're smaller and die immediately. Some of them have a longer life for whatever reason. So that looks pretty cool. So now we got a pretty basic fire effect here with embers. Gives a little bit something different. You can kind of see it from a distance. It's not super overpowering. You get up close, it gives you a little bit more nice detail. Looks pretty good. And there's just one more thing I want to add here. It's not super necessary. Certainly this is not something you'll want to add if you're seeing only from a distance. Like this is an effect that you're really only going to get the benefit of when you're up close. But it's a pretty cool effect. I just learned how to do it, so I wanted to share it with y'all. What we're going to do here is we're going to add a new set of sprites that's going to add heat distortion to our fire effect. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to make a material, and we're going to call this fire distortion. So we're going to open this, and what we're going to want to do here is we are going to want to make this translucent and unlit. Unlit because it's more performant, like I said, for the other material, and translucent because it's going to be just a heat distortion effect. We just want to use refraction to make it look interesting. And what we're going to do here is we're just going to trial this out. So I'm going to hit 1 and click to get a scalar parameter. I'm going to put that at 2 just to show you what the value looks like. And something to note here is that generally in translucent, you don't have a normal going on here, but if you put refraction in, suddenly the normal pops up, and we're going to use that in a minute. But for now, just plug in scalar float into refraction. It's 2, so it's going to be a pretty strong effect. And then we are going to drag a plane into the world here, and we're going to rotate this. And I got this trick from, we're going to throw this on here. And one thing I forgot to do is to put another scalar parameter here, and we want opacity to be 0. So this is totally transparent. So we see straight through it. All we want is the refraction effect. But as I was saying, I got this effect from an Unreal live stream from 2015, and I will include a link in the description. And I'm basically going to explain this in a very similar way to what they did. So if you want to see more about it, you can go there. But this is going to basically cover all the basics of it. So you can see if you look at this straight on, you don't see any refraction. And the way that sprite particles work is unless you tell it not to face the camera, it's going to face the camera. So if we just put this material onto a sprite, put it in our particle system, we wouldn't see any refraction at all because they're constantly going to be facing the camera. We want to actually be able to see this refraction, which you can only do by getting an angle to the normal of the surface. So if you're looking at it straight on and the normal's coming straight out at you, you're getting no refraction. So you can see, not ideal for what we want automatically. So what we want to do is we want to give this some normals so that we have something to refract the light coming through. Or, you know, this is not actually refracting light. This is just probably putting some displacement onto the pixels, but it's giving us the effect of light being refracted. So we're going to hold down T and click to get a texture sample. We're going to come in here and we're going to type in sphere. And I think we want the sphere render normals map. It's either that or sphere normal, smooth normal sphere, but we're going to go with this one. I think this is the one we wanted. And we're going to plug that into normal. And we're going to take a look and see if that was the one we wanted. I hope it was. Yeah, I think so. So you can see now we've got a sphere. So even if we're looking dead on into this thing, we're actually getting refraction. So that's cool. You notice we're also getting other refraction if we're at an angle, but we're not going to be at an angle. So we'll just get the sphere when we've got these camera facing sprites. But we don't just want it to be a circle because that looks a little strange. That's not quite what we're looking for. And this is also kind of hard edge, so we're going to fix that as well. So we're going to go back to fire distortion. We're going to pull another texture sample out here. And we want to get another engine content normal texture. And what we're going for here is this water normal. So if we open this up, you can see it's got this nice little wavy fluid texture to it. And that's going to be perfect for a fire distortion effect. Another thing to notice, I didn't mention this, but if you look at this texture is 512 by 512. Same with this one, which is probably a little bit of overkill for what we want to do. Not going to worry about it for this tutorial, but if you're trying to optimize this effect, one of the first things you want to do is probably get this texture size down because you're plastering this onto a bunch of particles. So, we use 128 by 128 for the other texture that we're using, and I think that's probably good for here. So you can just duplicate these, and I think if you change, if you hit this arrow here under compression and change the maximum texture size to 128, you'll see that changes up here and it changes the resource size. So you don't want to do that on the engine content. You want to duplicate this and then change it. But that could optimize this effect a little bit more than what we're going to be doing in this tutorial. So if you're looking to optimize it, keep that in mind. We're going to come back here. So what we want to do is we want to add these two textures together. So you add both of them together, you plug them into normals, and we're going to save it and take a look at that. So now you see we've got both sets of normals here. We have the sphere and we have the texture over it. Unfortunately, it's displaying what's outside the sphere, and we don't want that. We actually want this to only display inside the sphere. So we want it to have spherical normals and also this water normal, but nothing on the outside of that. So what we're going to do is we are going to lerp, and we're going to lerp this value. So we're going to lerp from 1 to that value, because 1 is essentially no refraction. If you go below 1, you get refraction in the other direction. So just keep that in mind. We're going to plug that in a refraction, and then we're going to get a... That was not... holding down R and clicking does not get you a radial gradient exponential, which is what we want. So you're going to have to search for that, plug that in alpha. And essentially what this is going to do is just fade off the effect away from the center of the sprite, which is exactly what we want, because we also don't really want a hard edge to this distortion. It's nicer if there's a little bit of a fade to it. So that'll mask it for us nicely. And we'll take a look and see what that looks like. So now you can see we get nothing at the outside. Then we get the spherical refraction, and we get this distortion effect from the water normals. And you'll also notice that, like, as you look at it, as you go in the circle, because we're using that radial gradient, the refraction gets larger until it gets to the center, and then it fades off to the other side. So that's why that radial gradient exponential is good here. You could also use a spherical mask, but then keep in mind you'll just get a hard edge between where you have refraction and where you don't, which could lead to some visual artifacts. So I think this is a nicer effect. And just through my tinkering, it didn't look like doing a sphere mask versus doing this radial gradient exponential had any difference in instructions. Some of the instructions might be more computationally heavy. Who knows? This works. It's not super awful performance-wise. So we're just going to be happy with that. However, we are going to change this value to 1.04 instead of 2. I just had it at a super high value just to show off what it looks like. We don't want it that high because we want it to be a fairly subtle effect. So we're going to save that. You could also parameterize this and drive this value through the particle system so that you could have, the refraction fade in and fade out. But this is such a subtle refraction effect, and there's so much going on in this this particle system that you're not really going to notice it popping in and out. So now if you look at it, like I said, pretty subtle. You can't really see it too much here. We'll actually see it better in the particle system. So now we've got that saved. And so what we're going to do here is super simple. It's not the most performant way to do this, but it is the quickest. So if you want something more performant, you'd probably want to create a different particle system that's spawning fewer particles. But just for the sake of time here, I'm just going to add a sprite renderer. And essentially what this is going to do, I already have a mesh renderer here. I'm adding sprites at the same locations. All of this is already calculated through all of these variables I have up here. The only things that aren't calculated are things that are specific to sprites as opposed to meshes. So like scale, rotation, things like that are not being calculated for these particles. So we're actually going to have to change the scale ourselves and the size for the particles. But the position and the velocity and all that kind of stuff is making it into here, which is great. We're not actually driving the color of this material, this distortion material that we're going to add. So it doesn't matter that it's receiving color over life. It's not important. Make sure this is compiled. Usually have issues with that in Niagara for some reason. So now you can see it looks a little strange here. It's not going to look this way. It's not going to distort the fire itself when we have the particle system in the game. It only does that in the editor for some reason. I'm not really sure why. But right off the bat, it's basically distorting wherever we have these mesh particles, which is nice. It's a little expensive. If you want to optimize, you might want to make a particle system outside of this because we're having 30 particles per second. But for just having one fire particle system in the scene, it's probably not that big a deal. If you're spawning a bunch of these, you might want to consider optimizing a lot more. But we're just going to go pretty simple here. We only need to do a couple things to make this really fit. I guess we could take a look at this just to see what it looks like in the world. I'm going to delete this, and we're going to go back over to our fire particle system. So you can already notice it's already working pretty well. The size is not matching up the way I want it to. You can tweak these numbers however you like, but I'm just going to go in. I have some numbers that I liked. I'm going to add sprite size. We're going to call this 25 by 25. So it's a little bit smaller than what we had before. And then I'm going to add size scale. So size scale, sprite size scale. So we want this to be a curve. And we're basically going to follow what we did with the mesh size curve. So we're going to use the same times. We're going to use different values because the sizes are different. And also the mesh size curve was using a float as a scalar. This is actually just the X and the Y values. So keep that in mind. You're going to have to change both values. So we're going to change this to 0.8 at time 0. We're going to add a key and value to all curves. We actually want this to be at 0.3 and 0.3. And the reason why I changed those separately is because if you select both of them, it does not let you change time for whatever reason, which is a little annoying, but it's fine. It's fine. We're going to put that value at 1.3 so it gets a little bit bigger, just like the mesh particles do. And then at time 1, we're just going to leave it at 0. So it's fading out just like the other particles. So not only are these particles spawning in the same place with the same velocity as the fire particles or the flame particles, it's also scaling over time at the same rate. And then we're going to select all these and also right click and make these auto so that we get a nice curved, interpolated, the smooth interpolated transition between these keyframes. And we're going to save that. And now we're going to look at this in the world, and you can see much subtler. It's not like curving the world around the fire. It's more just an effect when you look through the flames. So this is pretty subtle. You can make it a little bit bigger if you wanted to. So if you really wanted to give it a little bit of a rim, you could just bump up. Where's the sprite size here? We'll just say maybe 40. That might be too much. I don't know. So yeah, you can see you can give it a little bit more heat distortion around it. That becomes much more obvious. So we're going to bump that back down to 30, which is probably a good value. So you can see there's a little bit on the outside. If you really want to have that edge distortion as well, you really only see it really well when you look through it. And if you really look through there, it looks pretty cool. You get that fluid-like distortion from the water normals, and you get kind of a wavy, much more pronounced distortion from the spherical normals that we added in there. So you get to see both of those effects in there. And also, since we're spawning a bunch of these particles at the same time, it's actually, when you have a couple of them overlaying, it's actually modulating that even more, so that it, you get almost this wavy effect with the fire where the refraction isn't always constant. It's refracting different amounts depending on how many particles are popping up right there. And then so we can just walk around this, take a look at it. It looks pretty neat. You can see distorting my guy a little bit here. So he's receiving the refraction as well. And it just looks pretty cool. It's not meant to be realistic, but it does actually kind of look a little bit like fire distortion in real life. And it's a neat little subtle effect that you don't have to do a lot of work for. Like I said, you could probably do a lot of optimizing on this. This is not the most performant. If I back out of this and go down to shader complexity, you can notice this is not the most performant shader in the world. You can also look at overdraw. I mean, we've got a bunch of mesh particles here that are all additive, so you've got a bunch of overdraw going on. Not the most performant thing in the world. If we look at where is it? If we go here and we turn off the heat distortion effect, it does look better. Oh, that doesn't look better. That did not turn off the heat distortion effect. Sometimes these things don't take, so you have to go and do it directly in the particle system for some reason. Don't ask me why. It's supposed to remember it, but it just doesn't. So we're going to go in the particle system and turn it off to take a look at this. So now you can see it's off. And now we're going to look again at shader complexity. You can see this is not as complex. It's still not the most performant thing in the world because there are a lot of mesh particles overlapping each other here, but it looks better. Same with the overdraw. You can see it's not as bad. It's still not great. So definitely there is overhead to that heat distortion, but it looks really cool. So that's just something to keep in mind when you do an effect like that. Is more particles with their own materials that you're jamming in there. It's gonna add some complexity to the shaders and the overdraw and all that stuff, and so that's something to keep in mind performance-wise. Although I think if you don't have a bunch of these in scene, it's not going to be super bad. We can look at the frame rate right now. It's a little all over the place, but it's not awful. I mean, it's not taking a huge toll on performance. If I had a bunch of these in the scene, it might be a little worse. So just keep that in mind. Also, we can do things like optimize particle counts, change the texture size, things like that. So there are a bunch of different ways we can optimize this. You could also, if you wanted to have a higher fidelity effect, you could add more particles, and you could make the fire look a little bit fuller, because here if you look really closely at it, you can kind of see through it. It's not the most full effect because I've already kind of cranked the particle counts down with respect to the mesh particles, just because the more of those you have, the more complex the effect's going to be. So there's a lot we can do with that, but I think this is a good place for this video. We've got our flames, we've got these. In fact, I can make this look a little bit nicer. There we go. We got our flames, we got embers coming off of them, and we've got a heat distortion effect. And so there you go. You got a very basic fire particle system that would be a cool effect in a stylized game. Not really good in a realistic game. The color doesn't work well. The level of detail doesn't work well. Honestly, if you were going to do a realistic game with fire, you'd probably want to do something with sprite sheet with like a fluid simulation and sub UVs, so that you get a real realistic motion effect with more detail, and we don't have all that here. This is, you know, this is for your indie game. So hopefully hopefully this is helpful for somebody. I'm going to be making more of these videos, focusing on single effects like this. This one is a pretty broad use thing. A lot of games have fire. I'll probably be doing some more specific use cases. Like, I think the next one I'm going to do is a portal effect. Not like Portal the game, but just an interdimensional portal kind of thing. So I'll be covering a bunch of different types of effects in the coming weeks here on the channel, and I hope you stick around for it. If you wanna see those videos, just subscribe, and I'll be putting them out soon. If you got any questions about this effect here, just comment in the comments below. Ask away. I'll try and answer any and all questions as best I can. If you have any specific effects that you'd like to see me try and tackle here so that you can also learn it, just put that in the comments as well, and I'll see if I can make those happen. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I hope you learned something. Have a nice day.